They say hunger will make a man forget who he is. But that night, it made Ethan Cole walk through a stranger's door and into something he couldn't understand. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your town or state below. And if you believe a man can change without a gun ever being drawn, stay with me. Now back to the story. The cabin stood alone against a stretch of dry land that hadn't seen rain in near 3 months. Wood faded gray, roof patched with mismatched boards that caught the last of the sun like dull silver. Ethan had been riding for 2 days on half a canteen and nothing in his stomach but regret. His horse long gone, traded for a chance that didn't pay out, boots worn thin from miles that led nowhere. He saw the cabin from the ridge just before dusk, smoke curling slow from the chimney, thin but steady, the kind of smoke that meant someone still believed in staying put. He told himself he'd knock, told himself he'd ask. But hunger don't wait for pride, and pride don't fill a man's belly. By the time the shadows stretched long across the dirt, he was already at the back window, fingers testing the frame, wood soft enough to give with a quiet push. It opened with a low creak that sounded louder than it should have, like the cabin itself was warning him to think twice. He didn't. Inside, it smelled of cedar and something warm, bread, maybe, or dried herbs hanging from the beams above. The air held still, thick with the kind of silence that settles in places where words are used carefully, if at all. Ethan stepped in slow, boots barely touching the floor, eyes adjusting to the dim light slipping through narrow gaps in the walls. A table stood near the center, simple, clean, with a loaf of bread resting there like it had been waiting for him all along. He moved toward it without thinking, hand reaching, fingers brushing the crust, still soft, still warm. That's when he saw it. A knife beside the bread, blade worn but sharp, handle smooth from years of use. He picked it up, not for threat, just habit, just survival. Out here, a man didn't leave tools behind. Out here, you took what kept you alive. He was turning toward the door when the sound came, a soft click, deliberate, final. The kind of sound that didn't belong to wind, or wood, or chance. Ethan froze. Slowly he turned. She stood there. Not close. Not far. Just enough distance to make running feel pointless. The door behind her was shut, one hand resting lightly against it. Like she hadn't forced it closed, just guided it into place. She didn't look surprised. Didn't look angry. Her eyes held steady on him, dark and unreadable, like still water that ran deeper than it showed. Her clothes were simple, worn but clean, and around her neck hung a small piece of turquoise that caught the fading light in a quiet way, not shining, just present. Ethan tightened his grip on the knife without meaning to, his body already measuring space, angles, distance to the window, the weight of the moment settling in his chest like a stone. She didn't move, didn't raise her voice, just watched him, calm as if she'd been expecting this all along. Put it down, she said, her voice low, steady, not a command, not quite a request either. It was something else, something that made the room feel smaller. Ethan didn't answer. His throat felt dry, tongue heavy, mind running through choices that all ended the same way bad. He'd been in tighter spots, faced harder men. But this wasn't that. There was no edge in her stance, no fear to push against, no anger to use. Just quiet. And somehow, that was worse. How long since you ate? She asked. The question landed strange, like it didn't belong in the same moment as the knife in his hand. Ethan blinked, just once, thrown off balance in a way he couldn't explain. He could lie, could say he wasn't hungry, could keep playing the part of a man in control. But the smell of that bread filled the room, thick and undeniable, and his stomach answered for him with a low, hollow sound that echoed louder than his pride. Her gaze didn't change, didn't soften, didn't harden, just stayed there, steady as the ground beneath them. Eat, she said. No hesitation, no condition, just one word, placed between them like it meant more than it should. Ethan looked at the knife in his hand, then at the bread, then back at her. This wasn't right. People didn't do this. Not out here. Not to a man who'd just broken into their home. He waited for the catch, the shift, the moment she'd reach for something hidden. It didn't come. The silence stretched, long and thin, until it felt like it might snap. Slowly, he lowered the knife onto the table. Not dropped. Placed. Careful. Like the act itself mattered. He tore a piece of bread, brought it to his mouth, and for a moment, Everything else disappeared. The dry land, the long miles, the choices that led him here. All gone, replaced by something simple and immediate. Warmth, taste, the quiet relief of being alive for another minute. He ate faster than he meant to, hunger pulling him forward, each bite grounding him in a way nothing else had in days. She watched, not judging, not approving, just there. When he finished, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, the room felt different. Not safer, not yet, but changed, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be stepped back over. Now, she said, turning slightly, her hand leaving the door, you work. Ethan frowned, confusion cutting through the last of his hunger. Work? He repeated, the word rough in his mouth. She nodded once, simple, final. You take something, you give something back. No anger, no threat, just truth, spoken like it didn't need to be argued. Ethan glanced toward the window, measuring it again, the distance, the fading light outside. He could run. Maybe make it a mile before dark swallowed the land whole. Maybe not. His eyes shifted back to the table, to the knife he'd set down, to the empty space where the bread had been. Then to her. Still standing there. Still waiting. Not forcing. Not stopping him. Just offering something he didn't have a name for yet. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole wasn't sure which choice made him the kind of man he could live with. The sun had not moved far when Ethan stepped outside, but the heat already pressed down like a hand that did not intend to let go, dry wind dragging dust across the open land in thin, restless lines. And for a moment he just stood there, unsure if he had chosen to stay or simply failed to leave, his boots planted in dirt that did not belong to him, yet felt heavier than any road he had walked before, and behind him, inside that quiet cabin, she moved without sound, as if the place answered to her in ways he could not see, and that unsettled him more than any weapon ever had. He picked up the axe leaning against the wall, its handle worn smooth by years of use, and tested the weight. Familiar, honest, the kind of tool that did not lie about what it asked of a man. Then he turned toward the pile of uncut wood stacked uneven near the fence, each piece rough, stubborn, waiting, and he set his feet and brought the axe down. Once, twice, the sound sharp in the still air, echoing farther than it should, like the land itself was listening. Time moved different out there, not in hours but in breaths and sweat, and the slow ache building in his shoulders. And Ethan worked without counting, without speaking, each strike grounding him in something simple, something real, until the hunger that had driven him to that cabin faded into a dull memory, and something else took its place, something quieter, harder to name. He glanced back once, just once, expecting to find her watching from the doorway, measuring him, judging him, but she was not there, and that absence carried its own kind of weight, because a man could prepare for eyes on his back, but not for trust he had not earned. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, long and lonely, and Ethan realized how far he was from anything that could be called town, how easy it would be to disappear out there, how no one would come looking. And for the first time since stepping through that window, he understood that leaving would not feel like escape, it would feel like vanishing. By the time the sun climbed high, the pile of split wood had doubled, neat, ordered, and his hands were rough with fresh blisters that had not yet decided if they would break, sweat running down his back, soaking into his shirt, and still no voice called him in, no instruction followed, just silence stretching wide and patient, as if she knew he would not stop until he decided what kind of man he was going to be. When he finally lowered the axe, breath steady but deep, he noticed something that had not been there before, a bucket by the well, filled, a cup resting beside it, simple, clean, placed where he would see it without being told, and he hesitated again, that same strange feeling returning, the sense that every small thing in this place carried intention, that nothing was done without meaning. He walked over, lifted the cup, and drank, the water cool against the heat, clear, honest, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting it settle, letting the quiet wrap around him. And when he opened them, she was there, not in front of him, not behind, but to the side, as if she had always been part of the space and he had only just learned how to see it. Enough for now, she said, her voice as steady as before, no praise, no correction, just acknowledgement, and Ethan nodded without thinking, setting the cup down carefully. Like the act itself mattered more than the water he had taken. "There is more," she added, turning toward the back of the cabin where a section of fence leaned slightly, weathered by time and wind, and he followed, not because he had to, but because something in him had already decided to stay a little longer, just long enough to understand what this was. They worked in silence, side by side, but never in each other's way, her movements efficient, precise, hands knowing exactly where to press, where to tie, where to adjust. And Ethan found himself watching, not out of suspicion but out of respect. He did not expect to feel, because she did not rush, did not waste motion, did not speak unless there was something worth saying. And that kind of quiet carried more weight than any order barked across a crowded street. As the fence straightened, line by line, something in Ethan shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, like the land after the first drop of rain, and he realized he had stopped thinking about leaving, stopped measuring distance, stopped planning his next move, and that realization hit him harder than any hunger ever had. The afternoon stretched on, shadows growing longer, the light turning softer, and with it came a sound from far off, faint at first, then clearer, the steady rhythm of hooves against hard ground, not fast, not urgent, but certain, like they knew exactly where they were going. And Ethan straightened, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where dust began to rise in a thin, deliberate line. He felt it before he understood it, the shift in the air, the way the quiet changed, no longer empty but waiting, and beside him, she did not look up right away, did not react, just finished tying the last knot, pulling it firm, then standing slowly, brushing dust from her hands. And only then did she turn her gaze toward the approaching riders. Ethan followed her eyes and saw them. 3 figures at first, then 4, shapes growing clearer against the fading light, hats low, shoulders squared, the kind of men who carried confidence like it belonged to them. And instinct told him this was where things changed, where whatever this place had been for the past few hours would be tested against something outside it. He glanced at her, waiting for instruction, for warning, for anything that would tell him how to stand, how to act, but she only watched, calm, steady, as if the land itself had already decided how this moment would unfold. And in that stillness, Ethan understood one thing with a clarity that settled deep in his chest. He had not been given work just to earn a meal. He had been given a choice, and it was about to matter. The riders did not rush, and somehow that made them more noticeable, their horses moving at a steady pace that carried confidence without needing to prove it, dust trailing behind them in a thin line that stretched across the dry land like a quiet warning, and Ethan felt his hands tighten at his sides without realizing it. The memory of every road he had walked alone pressing back into him, telling him this was the moment a man either stepped forward or stepped away, and he did not yet know which one he would be. Beside him, she stood as she always had, still, grounded, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures without a trace of tension, and that calm began to shape the air around them, as if the land itself took its cue from her rather than the men riding toward it. The sound of hooves grew clearer, steady against the hard earth, each step measured, deliberate, until the riders came close enough for Ethan to make out. Their faces, sun-worn, confident, the kind of men who were used to being welcomed or feared, and one of them tipped his hat back slightly, his gaze moving from the cabin to the fence, then finally settling on her. He smiled, but it was not warmth. It was recognition mixed with something else, something that expected a reaction, and when none came, the smile lingered a moment too long before fading into something quieter. "Did not expect to find company out here," the man said, his voice carrying easy across the space between them, casual, as if he had already decided how this meeting would go, and Ethan felt the weight of the words settle in the air, waiting for a response that did not come. She did not step forward, did not step back, only shifted her gaze slightly, enough to acknowledge them, enough to show she had heard, but not enough to invite anything further. The second rider glanced toward Ethan, measuring him quickly, taking in the worn boots, the dust, the fresh marks of work on his hands, and something like amusement flickered in his eyes, as if he had already placed Ethan into a story that did not belong to him. "You hiring help now?" the second man added, lighter, almost joking, But the way his fingers rested near the saddle spoke of habits built over years, habits that did not disappear just because the words sounded easy. Ethan felt the question land on him, felt the pull to answer, to explain, to say something that would make his place here make sense. But before he could form the words, she spoke, her voice the same as before, steady, unhurried, cutting through the moment without force. He is working. And that was all. No explanation, no defense, just a statement that settled into the space between them like something already decided. The men exchanged a look, brief but clear, and the first rider's expression shifted again, not quite respect, not quite caution, but something closer to both than before, and for the first time since. They arrived. The air changed, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been drawn where none had been visible a moment earlier. The third rider leaned slightly in his saddle, eyes narrowing just enough to take a closer look at her, and then his gaze dropped, just for a second, to the small piece of turquoise at her neck, and whatever he saw there, whatever meaning it carried, passed through him like a quiet understanding. Because when he looked back up, the ease in his posture was gone, replaced by something more measured. He said nothing, but he reached out, touching the arm of the first rider in a small, deliberate way, and that touch said more than any warning could have, and the first rider noticed, his eyes flicking once more toward the turquoise, toward her, toward the ground beneath her feet, and then he exhaled slowly, as if adjusting something inside himself that had been set wrong. "We are just passing through," he said then, the words simpler now, stripped of whatever edge they carried before, and Ethan felt the shift fully, like a door closing quietly behind a man who had almost walked into the wrong room. She nodded once, not granting permission, not denying it, just acknowledging what had been said, and the moment stretched, quiet, balanced, on something unseen, until the riders began to move again, turning their horses without hurry, without another word, the dust rising once more as they rode away, smaller with each passing second until the land swallowed them back into distance. Ethan stood there, watching until they were gone, his breath steady but deeper than before, his mind trying to catch up to what had just happened, to the way men who carried themselves like they owned every mile around them had chosen to leave without pushing further, without testing, without taking, and none of it made sense the way the world had taught him it should. He turned to her then, questions rising, pressing at the edges of his silence, but she had already moved, walking back toward the cabin as if nothing of importance had occurred, as if this was just another part of the day, another moment that required no explanation. He followed, slower this time, his eyes drifting once more to the turquoise at her neck, to the way it caught the light without drawing attention, and something about it stayed with him, something that did not fit into the simple story he had told himself about who she was when he first stepped through that window. At the door, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the wood, and for a brief moment she looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him, and in that look was something new, not trust, not yet, but recognition, as if she had seen the choice he had not spoken out loud. "There is more to fix before night," she said, her voice softer now, not in tone but in weight, and Ethan nodded again, the motion coming easier this time, because somewhere between the sound of hooves and the quiet way those men had turned away, he had begun to understand that this place was not what it seemed, and neither was the woman who stood before him, and whatever test he had stepped into was far from over. The light began to fall slower as the sun leaned toward the horizon, stretching shadows long across the land, turning the dry ground into something softer, almost forgiving, and Ethan moved with it, carrying another bundle of wood toward the side of the cabin where she had pointed without words, his muscles tired now but steady, his breathing deeper, more controlled, as if the rhythm of work had settled something restless inside him that had not known rest in a long time. The air cooled just enough to carry new sounds, subtle ones, the creak of wood as the heat let go, the distant rustle of brush where small animals moved without being seen, and beneath it all, the quiet presence of the place itself, no longer empty, no longer indifferent, but aware in a way he could not explain. He set the wood down where the others were stacked, careful again without thinking, aligning the edges, straightening what did not need straightening. And when he stepped back, he noticed it, how Everything here held order without being forced. How nothing was wasted, nothing left undone, and it made him wonder how long she had been doing this alone. How many days had passed like this before he stepped into it uninvited. She was near the well again, drawing water with the same quiet precision, the rope moving through her hands without sound, the bucket rising smooth and steady, and for a moment Ethan watched, not out of suspicion now, but curiosity, the kind that came when something refused to fit the shape you expected it to. "You always work like this?" he asked, the words leaving him before he could decide if they should, his voice rough from disuse, from hours spent speaking only through action. She did not look at him right away, did not answer immediately, just set the bucket down, letting the rope fall slack in her hands, and then she turned, her gaze settling on him with that same steady weight. "Like what?" she replied, and there was no challenge in it, just a simple question that made him realize he had not thought his own words through. Ethan shifted slightly, glancing around as if the answer might be written somewhere in the way the fence stood or the wood was stacked. "Like you are not expecting anything," he said finally, and the moment the words left him, he knew they were not quite right, but they were close enough to what he meant. She studied him for a second longer, then shook her head once, small, almost unnoticeable. "I expect what is given," she said, and there it was again. That way of speaking that sounded simple until you tried to carry it, until you realized it weighed more than it should. Ethan frowned, not because he disagreed, but because he could not place where that left him, what he had given, what he still owed, and whether this was about balance or something else entirely. The wind shifted again, cooler now, brushing against his skin with the promise of night, and he felt it then, the quiet change that came when a day moved toward its end, when choices made in the light had to live through the dark. She stepped past him, moving toward the back of the cabin, where a small fire pit sat, stones arranged in a circle that had seen use but not neglect, and she knelt, placing kindling with practiced hands, each piece set just so, and Ethan hesitated only a moment before following, crouching across from her, watching as she worked. The way the fire came to life not with force but patience, a small flame catching, growing, steady, until it held its place against the coming dark. The light from it touched her face, softening the lines, catching in her eyes, in a way that made them seem deeper, older, and for a brief moment Ethan forgot the road, forgot the hunger, forgot even why he had come through that window, because this quiet, this steady rhythm, felt like something he had been walking toward without knowing it. "You can leave," she said then, without looking up, her hands still moving, adjusting the wood, feeding the fire just enough to keep it alive, and the words landed between them like a door opening, not forced, not pushed, just there, waiting. Ethan did not answer right away. The thought of leaving returning now with a different weight than before, not escape, not survival, but choice. And he realized how strange that felt, how unfamiliar it was to stand in a place where no one was driving him forward or pushing him away. He looked toward the open land beyond the fence, the long stretch of nothing that led to everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and then back to the cabin, to the fire, to her, and he shook his head once, quiet, almost to himself. "Not yet," he said, and the words settled into the night air like they belonged there. She nodded, just once, as if that was all that needed to be said, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fire crackling soft, the sky above turning from gold to deep blue, stars beginning to show one by one, distant and steady, like they had been watching long before either of them arrived. Ethan reached for a small piece of wood, placing it carefully on the edge of the fire, mirroring her movements without thinking, and in that simple act, something shifted again, something quiet and real, the kind of change that did not announce itself but stayed, growing slowly, like roots beneath the surface. He glanced once more at the knife on the table inside, visible through the open doorway, still where he had left it, untouched, and for the first time since he picked it up, he did not think of taking it, did not measure its weight in his hand, did not consider what it could get him on the road, and that absence felt louder than any thought he had carried before. The night settled fully then, wrapping the land in a calm that held both peace and uncertainty, and as Ethan sat there, watching the fire, listening to the quiet that no longer felt empty, He understood something he had not been ready to see when the day began. This was not about the bread, not about the work, not even about the riders who had turned away. This was about the moment he chose to stay, and what that choice would ask of him when the morning came. The night did not rush. It settled in slow, like a blanket laid carefully over the land, and Ethan sat there by the fire long after the last light faded from the horizon, watching the flames shift and breathe, each crackle pulling his thoughts deeper into a place he had not let himself go in years, a place where silence was not something to outrun, but something to listen to. He did not remember the last time he had stayed anywhere without planning his next step, measuring distance, counting what little he had left. But here, time did not ask for that. It stretched wide and patient, and for once, nothing was chasing him forward. She had moved inside without a word, leaving him with the fire and the open sky, and he noticed that she did not close the door, did not lock it, did not even glance back to see if he would follow. And that small thing carried more trust than anything she had said all day. The stars came out clearer than he had seen in a long time, sharp and steady, spread across the sky like they had been waiting for him to look up again. And he did, leaning back slightly, letting the cool air settle into his lungs, the scent of smoke and sage lingering around him, grounding him in a way that felt both unfamiliar and right. His eyes drifted again toward the open doorway, toward the table inside where the knife still rested exactly where he had placed it, untouched, unclaimed. And he realized he had been measuring himself against that knife since the moment he picked it up, not as a tool, but as a line, something that marked who he had been and who he might become. And now, sitting there with nothing between him and the night, he felt that line shift. A soft sound came from inside, not loud, not urgent, just the quiet movement of someone who knew their space without needing light. And Ethan stood after a moment, brushing dust from his hands, stepping toward the cabin with a hesitation that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with not wanting to disturb what he did not yet understand. He paused at the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, and saw her near the table, arranging something simple, a cloth, a small bowl, movements steady and unhurried. And when she noticed him, she did not react, did not ask why he was there, just nodded once toward the space across from her, an invitation without words. Ethan stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin different now from before, not just a place to take from, but a place that had allowed him to stay. And he sat where she had indicated, his eyes once again catching the knife on the table between them, closer now, clearer, its worn edge reflecting the low firelight. She placed the bowl in front of him, something simple, beans, maybe a bit of dried meat, nothing rich, nothing excessive, but more than enough, and she sat across from him, not watching him eat, not measuring, just present. He hesitated for a second, then reached forward, eating slower this time, not driven by hunger alone, but by something else, something that made each bite feel like it carried weight beyond itself. "You always feed strangers?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter now, less guarded, and she looked at him, her expression unchanged. "You are not a stranger anymore," she said, and the words settled into him deeper than he expected, because they were not said lightly, not offered freely. They were given as something earned, even if he did not yet understand how. Ethan nodded once, more to himself, then to her, and his gaze dropped again to the knife, to the way it sat between them like a question he had not answered. And he felt it then, the choice returning, clearer now, sharper, not about staying or leaving, not about work or food, but about that one thing, whether he would take it when she was not looking, whether he would carry that piece of himself forward or set it down for good. She stood before he finished, moving toward the back of the cabin where a small shelf held a few items, each placed with care, and she picked up something wrapped in cloth, holding it for a moment before turning back to him. "Tomorrow," she said, placing it on the table beside the knife, "there is more work," and her tone did not change, but something in it carried a quiet expectation, not of labor, but of something deeper, something that stretched beyond the fence, beyond the cabin, into whatever came next. Ethan looked at the wrapped object, then back at her, questions rising again, but he did not ask them, not yet, because he was beginning to understand that answers here did not come when you demanded them. They came when you were ready to see them. The fire outside crackled softly, the night holding steady, and for the First time in a long while. Ethan Cole sat in a place where nothing was being taken from him, and that alone made the choice in front of him heavier than anything he had ever carried. The fire had burned low by the time Ethan finally leaned back from the table, the last warmth of the meal settling into him in a way that felt heavier than food alone, and across from him the wrapped cloth remained untouched, placed beside the knife like two different answers waiting for the same question. The room had grown quieter, not empty, but full in a way that made every small movement carry meaning. And he noticed how she did not rush the night, did not fill it with words, did not ask him what he would do next, as if the choice itself mattered more than any explanation he could give. He sat there for a long moment, eyes moving between the knife and the cloth, feeling the pull of both, one familiar, one unknown, and the weight of that pull settled deep in his chest. "What is it?" he asked finally, nodding toward the cloth, his voice steady but quieter than before, and she followed his gaze, then looked back at him without hesitation. "Something you will need if you stay," she said, simple, direct, as if the answer was enough. Ethan frowned slightly, not at the words, but at what they implied, because nothing here had been given without reason, and nothing had been taken without cost, and he was beginning to understand that whatever lay inside that cloth was not just a tool, not just another thing to carry. It was part of the test he had stepped into the moment he crossed that threshold. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the fabric, pausing just long enough to feel the hesitation, then unwrapped it with care, the cloth falling open in quiet folds to reveal a small object, worn but well kept, a leather cord with a piece of carved wood attached, simple at first glance, but marked with lines that carried meaning he could not read yet could feel. He picked it up, turning it slightly in his hand, the surface smooth where fingers had touched it over time, the weight light but present, and something about it made him straighten, not in fear, not in doubt, but in awareness. "It was my father's," she said, her voice softer now, not weaker, just deeper, as if the words came from a place she did not open often, and Ethan looked up at her, surprised not by the statement, but by the fact that she had offered it at all. "Why give it to me?" he asked, the question coming easier now, less guarded, more honest, and she held his gaze for a moment before answering. "I did not give it to you," she said, and there was no correction in her tone, just truth. "I placed it in front of you," and the distinction settled between them like a line drawn in the dust, clear, undeniable. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the cord, because he understood then, this was not a gift, not in the way he had known gifts before. This was a choice, the same as the knife, the same as the bread, the same as the work, and whatever he decided would say more about him than anything he could speak. The fire outside cracked softly, the sound carrying through the open doorway, and the night pressed closer, wrapping the cabin in a quiet that felt almost watchful, as if the land itself was waiting to see what he would do. He looked down again at the two objects on the table, the knife still resting where he had left it, familiar, easy, something he could take and walk away with before the first light of morning, and the cord in his hand, unfamiliar, asking something he had not yet defined. His mind drifted back, not far, just enough to feel the road again. The long miles, the empty days, the choices made out of need rather than meaning, and he realized how often he had taken without thinking, how often he had walked away without looking back, and how none of it had ever felt like enough. He set the cord down gently, not rejecting it, not accepting it yet, just placing it back on the cloth, then reached toward the knife, his fingers hovering above it, close enough to feel its presence, its promise of something simple, something known, and he stayed there for a moment, the silence stretching, the decision sharpening. Across from him, she did not move, did not speak, did not even shift her gaze. And that stillness held more weight than any command could have, because it left the choice entirely his. Ethan exhaled slowly, then pulled his hand back from the knife, not in hesitation, but in decision, and instead he gathered the cloth, wrapping the cord back inside it with the same care she had shown, and placed it closer to himself, not claiming it fully, but choosing it over what he had been. She watched that movement, just once, her eyes softening in a way that was almost invisible, and she nodded, not in approval, not in praise, but in recognition, as if something had shifted that did not need to be spoken. Tomorrow, she said again, standing now, moving toward the door. We leave before the sun is high. And Ethan looked up, the words settling into him with a new weight. Leave, not run, not escape, but move forward. And for the first time since he had stepped into that cabin, he did not wonder where he would go next. He only wondered who he would be when he got there. The fire outside burned steady, the stars holding their place above. And as the night carried on, Ethan Cole sat with the choice he had made, feeling it settle into him like something real, something that would not fade with the morning. Because this time, for once, he had not taken the easier path, and that alone felt like the beginning of something he had not known how to look for. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slow, a pale light stretching across the horizon before the sun ever showed itself. And Ethan was already awake when it came, sitting just outside the cabin where the last embers of the fire still glowed faint beneath a layer of ash. The air cooler now, carrying that quiet edge that only exists before the day begins. He had not slept much, not because of discomfort, but because something inside him had shifted too deeply to ignore, the kind of change that keeps a man still while everything else moves around him. He glanced back through the open doorway, the table just visible in the dim light, and the knife still rested there exactly where it had been, untouched, unchanged. A quiet reminder of what he had chosen not to take, and for the first time in years, that felt like more than a small thing. Behind him, the soft sound of footsteps approached, measured, familiar now, and he did not turn right away because he knew it was her, the rhythm of her movement already part of the place, already part of something he had begun to understand without needing it explained. We leave now, she said, her voice low, steady, and Ethan stood without hesitation, brushing the dust from his hands, his body responding before his mind had time to question it. The sky had begun to warm, faint streaks of gold pushing through the pale blue, and the land stretched wide and open before them. The same land he had crossed alone so many times, yet it did not feel the same now, not with her walking ahead of him, not with purpose in her steps instead of escape. He noticed she carried little, just a small satchel over her shoulder, light enough to move without slowing her, and that told him something again, that whatever they were going to do did not require more than moving forward. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that gradually shortened, the heat beginning its slow climb, and Ethan found himself watching the land differently now, noticing details he had ignored before, the way the ground shifted in color, the faint traces of paths that were not marked but known, the signs of life that did not announce themselves. Where are we going? He asked finally, not out of doubt, but because the question felt right to ask now. She kept her eyes ahead, her pace steady. To finish what you started, she said, and the words settled into him with a weight he could not ignore. Ethan frowned slightly, thinking back, the bread, the work, the knife, the choice, and none of it felt unfinished in the way he understood things. Yet her tone carried certainty, not suggestion, and he knew better now than to dismiss what he did not yet understand. They walked on, the land opening into a wider stretch, the ground flatter, the horizon clearer, and in the distance, something began to take shape, faint at first, then more defined, a cluster of structures, low and spread out, not a town, not quite, but something that held presence. Ethan slowed slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took it in, the way it sat against the land without fighting it, the way it seemed to belong rather than claim, and he felt that same shift again, the one he had felt when the riders turned away, when the turquoise caught the light, when something unseen became understood. Without words, she did not stop, did not change her pace, just continued forward, and Ethan followed, the distance closing between them and the place ahead. And as they drew nearer, he began to notice movement, figures emerging slowly, not rushing, not reacting with alarm, just present, watching, aware. His breath slowed, not out of fear, but because something in him recognized the moment, recognized that whatever test he had stepped into was reaching a point he could not step back from. They reached the edge of the settlement, if it could be called that, and the figures stood there, silent, their eyes moving from her to him, measuring, not with hostility, not with welcome, but with something deeper, something that weighed more than either. Ethan felt it settle on him, that attention, that quiet judgment, and for a brief moment, The old instinct returned, to step back, to leave, to disappear before anything could be asked of him. But he did not move. He stayed where he was, because somewhere along the way, that instinct had lost its hold. She stepped forward then, just one pace, and the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and one of the figures lowered his head slightly, not in submission, not in ceremony, but in recognition. And that small movement carried more meaning than any word spoken. Ethan stood there, feeling the weight of the place, the people, the moment, and he understood now. The cabin had not been the test, not really. It had been the beginning, the quiet place where a man could choose who he was without anyone watching. And this was where that choice would be seen. No one stepped forward to greet him, and no one turned away. They simply stood there, watching, the way people do when they already know more than they say. And Ethan felt that silence settle around him. Not heavy, not threatening, but certain, like the ground beneath his boots would not shift no matter what he chose next. The structures behind them were simple, wood and earth shaped by hands that understood the land rather than tried to control it. Smoke rising in thin lines that carried the same scent he had known at the cabin. Familiar now, steady, and the people moved within that space with a quiet purpose, not hurried, not idle, just present in a way that made the place feel alive without noise. She did not introduce him, did not explain. She only walked forward, and the space opened for her without being asked. A path forming not out of obedience but recognition, and Ethan followed, aware of every step, every glance that passed over him, measuring, not with judgment, but with something deeper, something that asked who he was without asking a single word. They stopped near the center, where the ground had been cleared smooth, and an older man stood there, his posture straight despite the years that showed in the lines of his face, his eyes steady, holding the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. And when she stepped closer, he inclined his head slightly, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement, as if something already understood had been confirmed. Ethan stood just behind her, unsure of where to place himself, not wanting to step forward uninvited, not wanting to appear as though he was hiding. And that uncertainty settled in his chest in a way that felt new, not fear, but awareness of being seen for more than the surface. The older man's gaze shifted to him then, slow, deliberate, and for a moment it felt as though everything else faded, the movement, the sound, the heat of the day, leaving only that look, steady and searching. And Ethan did not look away, not because he was certain of himself, but because something in him had decided that running from this moment would undo everything he had already chosen. "You came from the cabin," the man said, his voice low but carrying easily, and Ethan nodded once, simple, honest, because there was no reason to hide that. "And you stayed," the man continued, and again Ethan nodded, the weight of that choice settling into the space between them. The man's eyes moved, briefly to her, then back to Ethan, and there was a pause, not empty, but full, as if something was being measured that could not be seen. "Many passed that place," the man said. "Few remained." And the words were not praise, not warning, just truth, laid out without decoration. Ethan felt them land, felt the quiet meaning behind them, and he understood then that the cabin had never been just a shelter. It had been a question, one that most men answered without even knowing it was being asked. "He worked," she said then, her voice steady, and it was the first time she had spoken about him in front of others, and those two words carried more weight than any explanation could have. The older man considered that, his gaze not leaving Ethan, and then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to shift something in the air, enough to tell the others that what had been seen was accepted. No one clapped, no one spoke, but the stillness changed, softened slightly, as if the space around Ethan had widened just enough to let him stand without being measured at every breath. "There is more to finish," the man said, turning slightly, his attention already moving forward, and Ethan followed the direction of his gaze, seeing beyond the central clearing, past the structures, toward a stretch of land where the ground dipped slightly, where something was not complete, something waiting. He felt it then, the meaning of her words from earlier, to finish what you started, not in the cabin, not with the wood or the fence, but here, in this place, in front of people who would see the result. She stepped forward again, not leading him now, but walking beside him, and together they moved toward that open stretch. The eyes of the others no longer fixed on him, but still present, still aware, like a quiet reminder that what he did next would not be unseen. As they reached the edge of the unfinished ground, Ethan could see it clearly now, a line marked out but not completed, posts set in some places, gaps in others, a boundary that was meant to stand but had not yet been made whole, and he understood without being told. This was work, yes, but it was also something else, something that defined where one space ended and another began, something that held meaning beyond the physical. He looked at her, and she met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough to confirm what he already felt. Then she nodded once toward the tools resting nearby. Simple, worn, ready. Ethan stepped forward, picking one up, the weight familiar in his hands, but the purpose different now. And as he set the first post, pressing it into the earth with steady force, he felt the ground give just enough to hold it, to accept it, and that small resistance, that small acceptance, echoed something deeper inside him. The sun climbed higher, the heat returning, and he worked, not alone this time. Others moving nearby, not directing him, not correcting him, but present, each doing their part, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole was not passing through a place. He was helping shape it, one steady motion at a time, under eyes that did not judge him by what he had taken, but by what he chose to give. The sun stood high now, pressing its weight down across the open land, and Ethan could feel it in his shoulders, in the steady burn of muscle that came not from strain alone, but from repetition, from choosing to stay with the work long after the body asked for rest. And still he did not stop, because something deeper than fatigue held him there, something that had taken root the moment he placed the first post into the ground. The line they were building stretched farther than he had first thought, each section revealing another gap, another place where something needed to be set right, and Ethan moved along it with a rhythm that had begun to feel natural, lifting, setting, pressing, aligning, each motion simple on its own but meaningful when seen as part of the whole. The others worked nearby, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to ignore him, their presence steady, unspoken, and every now and then he caught a glance, not sharp, not suspicious, just aware, as if they were watching the same question unfold in real time. The ground resisted in places, harder patches that required more effort, softer spots that took the post too easily and had to be adjusted, and Ethan found himself learning the land with each step, feeling where it held firm, where it shifted, where it demanded patience, and that understanding came without words, without instruction, just through doing, through staying. She moved along the line as well, not overseeing, not directing, just working, her pace even, her hands sure, and every time Ethan looked up, she was there somewhere within view, never close enough to guide him, never far enough to leave him alone. And that balance settled into him in a way that felt both unfamiliar and right. The heat rose as the day climbed, the air thickening, the horizon wavering slightly in the distance, and still the work continued, steady, deliberate. Each post another mark, another decision made visible, and Ethan realized he was no longer counting the distance, no longer measuring how much remained. He was simply moving forward, one piece at a time, at some point, without him noticing exactly when. The sound of his breath matched the rhythm of his movement, the weight of the tool in his hands no longer a burden but an extension, and the land beneath his boots no longer foreign but known. And that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. He paused only once, straightening slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and when he looked up, he saw the line behind him, not perfect, not flawless, but standing, holding, and for a brief moment, something like recognition passed through him, not pride, not yet, but something close, something that said this mattered. The older man stood at a distance, watching not with intensity but with patience, his posture unchanged, his presence steady as the land itself, and when Ethan's eyes met his, there was no nod, no gesture, just the same calm gaze. As if the work spoke louder than anything either of them could say, a breeze moved through then, light but welcome, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and it cooled the sweat on Ethan's skin just enough to remind him that the day would not last forever. that the sun would fall, that what he did now would remain when it did. He reached down again, lifting another post, setting it into place, pressing it firm, adjusting it until it stood straight. And as he stepped back, he noticed something he had not seen before. The line was beginning to connect, gaps closing, spaces filling, not just wood in the ground, but a boundary taking shape, something that marked more than land, something that defined where one thing ended and another began. He glanced toward her then, and she was watching him, not directly, not openly, but aware, and when their eyes met for a brief second, she gave the smallest nod, almost nothing, but enough, and Ethan felt it, that acknowledgement, not given freely, not handed out, but earned in quiet, steady ways. The afternoon stretched on, the light shifting slowly, shadows beginning to return, and with each passing hour, the line grew longer, stronger, more complete, until Ethan realized they were nearing the end, the final section where the last few posts would close what had been left open. He moved toward it with a different kind of awareness now, not urgency, not relief, but intention, because he understood that finishing something carried its own weight, that the last step often mattered more than the first, the ground. Here was harder, packed tight, resistant, and he worked at it with care, not forcing, not rushing, adjusting his approach until it gave just enough, until the post could be set true, and when he finally pressed it into place, aligning it with the others, stepping back to see it stand, something settled inside him, quiet but firm. Needed, the work spoke for itself. The older man stepped closer then, his boots pressing into the same ground Ethan had worked, and he stopped a few feet away, not closing the distance fully, not creating space either, just standing where both could see the line clearly. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze moving along the posts, following their alignment, their steadiness, their quiet strength. "It stands," he said finally, his voice low, simple, and those two words held more meaning than any praise Ethan had ever heard, because they were not about effort, not about time. They were about result, about truth, about something that could not be argued. Ethan nodded once, not out of habit, but because he felt the weight of those words and knew they were earned, not given. The man's eyes shifted then, meeting Ethan's again, steady, searching, but no longer measuring in the same way, and after a moment, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried no ceremony yet held deep recognition, and with that, he turned, his attention moving back toward the settlement, as if the matter had been settled without needing anything further. Ethan stood there a moment longer, the quiet returning around him, but it no longer felt like something he had to fill. It felt like something he could stand within, something that did not ask anything of him except that he remain present. She approached then, her steps as measured as always, her gaze moving along the line, taking it in, without lingering, and when she reached him, she stopped, not directly in front of him, but beside him, both of them facing the same direction, looking at what had been built. "You finished it," she said, her voice steady, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the words settling into him differently than he expected, not as a statement of completion, but as acknowledgement of the path that had led there. "We did," he replied, the correction quiet, almost instinctive, and she glanced at him then, just for a moment, and there was something in that look, something that shifted slightly, not surprise, not approval, but recognition of a different kind, the kind that comes when someone steps beyond themselves without being told to. The wind moved across the land again, softer now, carrying the scent of evening as the sun began its slow descent, the light turning warmer, longer shadows stretching once more across the ground, and Ethan felt the day settling, not ending, but changing, like a breath drawn and released. "Come," she said after a moment, turning toward the settlement, and Ethan followed without question, his steps lighter now, not because the work had been easy, but because something inside him had shifted enough to carry the weight differently. As they walked back, the people they passed no longer watched him the same way. The glances were still there, but they held something else now, something quieter, something that did not need to be proven again, and Ethan felt it, that subtle change, that space opening just enough for him to stand without being questioned. They reached the center again, the same place where the older man had stood, and the fire there had been lit, its flame steady, not large, not small, just enough to gather around. And people moved near it, some sitting, some standing, all present in that same quiet way that had defined the place from the moment he arrived. She stopped at the edge of the firelight, and Ethan did the same, the warmth reaching them, the glow soft against the coming dusk, and for a moment, nothing was said, nothing was needed. Then she reached into her satchel, drawing out the cloth she had given him the night before, still wrapped, still holding the weight of a choice he had not yet fully claimed. And she held it out to him, not offering, not insisting, just placing it within his reach again, the same as before. Ethan looked at it, then at her, and he understood now that this moment was not separate from the others. It was part of the same path, the same test, the same quiet question that had followed him from the cabin to this place. He took the cloth slowly, unwrapping it once more, the carved piece of wood resting in his hand, familiar now in a way it had not been before, and without hesitation, he lifted it, slipping the cord over his head, letting it settle against his chest, the weight light but present, and as it touched him, something inside him aligned, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt steady and real. She watched that movement, her gaze calm, and then she nodded. Once, the same small gesture as before, but this time it carried something more, something final, and Ethan felt it, that shift, that quiet acceptance that did not need to be spoken aloud. The fire crackled softly, the voices around them low, the sky deepening into evening. And as Ethan stood there with the cord resting against him, he realized that the man who had stepped through that window had not just been hungry, he had been empty. And now, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something filling that space, not with noise, not with comfort, but with purpose, something that would not fade when the road called again, because this time, he would not be walking it the same way. The fire held steady as the night deepened, its glow settling across faces and ground alike, and Ethan stood just at the edge of it, the cord resting against his chest, light in weight, but heavier than anything he had carried before, and for a while he did not move, did not speak. He simply listened, to the quiet murmur of voices, to the soft shift of feet against dirt, to the way this place existed without needing to prove itself to anyone. He had known towns that filled the air with noise, men who spoke loud to make themselves heard. But here, nothing was forced, and somehow that made everything clearer. She remained beside him, not close, not distant, her presence steady like it had been from the beginning, and he realized that she had not once told him who she was, not directly, not in words, yet everyone here knew, and more than that, they moved with that knowing in a way that did not need explanation. The older man approached again, slower this time, his steps measured, and when he stopped near them, the firelight caught the lines of his face, deep, steady, shaped by years that had not bent him but settled into him. And his gaze moved first to her, then to Ethan, lingering just long enough to acknowledge what had already been seen. "It fits," the man said, nodding once toward the cord at Ethan's chest, and the words were simple. But Ethan understood, this was not about the object itself. It was about what had been chosen, what had been carried, and what would now be.